So welcome friends, this is our Lenten book study for this year, and I'm the Reverend Joe Pagano. And over the next 5 Tuesdays, we're going to be looking at a book by NT Wright called God and the Pandemic, a Christian reflection on the coronavirus and its aftermath. There you go. I'm going to be presenting on NT Wright's book. You don't have to read it, but if you do want to read it and read along, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So the book has 5 chapters, and so for the next 5 Tuesdays in Lent, I'll be offering summaries of each chapter for our reflection. And we'll also offer an online Zoom discussion on the 3rd and 5th Tuesday for anybody who wants to come together online for a discussion of the book and the material. More information about that to come. So just briefly, the book is timely, right? It's about God and the pandemic. I looked and I could only find 2 books published on this, one by Walter Brueggemann and one by NT Wright. And Brueggemann's book actually collects some essays that he previously wrote, so this is kind of the first one I think that somebody got out there. So what's that mean? That means certainly it's not the last word, right? And we're not even saying that we agree with everything that Wright has to say in this book, but it is a thoughtful Christian reflection on God and the pandemic. And we thought it would be a good opportunity for us, everybody who joins us, to give us some food for thought, an opportunity for reflection on Scripture and on this pandemic that we're all going through, and maybe a way to focus our prayers at this time. So that's what we are going to do together. Like I said, I'm just going to try to present the basic arguments that we find in each of Wright's chapter. Maybe we'll have some time to discuss that when we come together online, but I just want to give you the gist, and then you can think about those things and reflect on those things. Okay? So first, before I get to the first chapter, I just want to briefly mention the aim of NT Wright's book, God and the Pandemic. And he says his aim is not to offer solutions to the questions raised by the pandemic. Okay, so this isn't going to be, I'm going to answer all your questions about the pandemic. He says, that's not what I'm going to do. He also says, this is not an attempt to offer a complete analysis of every issue and everything we've learned about this pandemic, and in light of that, our understanding of the Scriptures. He's not trying to offer a complete analysis there. And he really says he's not trying to tell us what we ought to do now. Rather, he says, now is the time to resist knee-jerk reactions. That phrase, I never quite know what it means. Knee-jerk, quick reactions, right? Quick answers, quick analysis, quick saying, okay, I know what we have to do and we have to do it. He said, that's at least not what he's going to try to do. He wants to resist that. He says, we need time to lament. This is a time that we ought to exercise restraint and not jump into solutions. Eventually, he hopes, new light will come, and maybe the way forward will be made clear. But we're right in the midst of this, I think he's thinking, and that his book is not about rushing to answers or solutions or practical things we should be doing. His answer is a reflection, a time of lament, a time to pray before we go forward. So that's his approach. That's what we're going to find in this book. Okay, so where does he start? And that's the first chapter is how do we start thinking about God in the pandemic? Where do we begin? And he begins with framing the question with a number of questions. Does anybody know what's going on, right? Why is this happening? Is someone trying to tell us something? And what are we supposed to do about it, right? Questions that maybe you have asked or heard other people ask about this pandemic that we're all going through. And what he does in this first chapter is review answers to these questions that he thinks are inadequate. So this is a framing of the issue and a really kind of a ground clearing. Okay, let's frame the issue. Let's name some of the questions that people are putting out there, and then maybe name some of the answers and show why they're inadequate. At least that's what he's going to do. So what are some of the wrong answers that he sees out there? Or at least less than helpful answers, according to NT Wright. Well, one answer from the ancient world, he says, but also in other parts of the world today, is that, well, the gods must be angry, right? In the ancient world, these kinds of disasters were associated with angry gods, right? So, and the question was, then you had to figure out, why are the gods angry? And answers would be, well, maybe I didn't offer the right sacrifice, or I didn't offer the right prayers, or maybe we humans did something terribly dreadful that caused this response that angered the gods. He doesn't much think that's a very good answer, but it is an answer that was found in the ancient world and maybe parts of the world today. But he quickly moves on to three still ancient responses from ancient philosophers, but he also sees these playing out in the modern period as well. So I'll mention them. And he also thinks none of these are very good either. So from the philosophers, the first is an ancient philosophy called Stoicism. And this is how he characterizes it. I'll say a little bit more. He says, everything is programmed to turn out the way it does, right? We can't change it, so we might as well just learn to fit ourselves in and adjust ourselves to the way things are. So for readers of NT Wright, he talks about Stoicism a little bit more in his book, Simply Christian. And there he identifies Stoicism as a form of pantheism. It's a big word. Essentially means God is everywhere and everywhere is God, or God is everything and everything is God. And this way of conceiving of the world in relationship to God is to see the divine, or God, as a divine force which permeates everything, right? And then the human question, and really the human obligation, is to get in touch with this force or power that permeates all things, and then to live in harmony with that, right? That's what we do. In that book, Simply Christian, he says the real problem with this view is that it can't cope with evil, right? With things like this terrible pandemic we are going through. Basically, it says the divine and the world are the way things are, and we can't change things, right? And moreover, nobody's going to come and rescue you, right? And so the Stoic response is essentially get used to it and adjust yourself to reality, and that's that. So that's the first wrong philosophical answer. The second wrong philosophical answer, he says, is Epicureanism. And so Epicureans, this is how he characterizes it in this little book. He says, everything that we experience essentially in this world is random. And we can't do anything about it, so we might as well make ourselves as comfortable as we can. He says a little bit more in, again, if you read Simply Christian, about Epicureans there. Epicureans said, there may be gods, but if they are, they're in the realm of heaven, and they really, they're not going to get involved in this world at all. Right, we're sort of, so he sees this as a form of dualism, right, that the spheres of heaven and the spheres of earth are really far apart. And if they're gods, they're up there doing whatever they're doing, and they're not going to intervene in this world. So they're so far apart from us, we are sort of on our own. And so the best thing we can do is to enjoy life as best we can. And he seems to think that this was a philosophy that appealed to the well-off, because well, then you could just sort of have your walled garden and your lovely, your lovely meals and parties, and sort of try to create a nice little place where you can eat, drink, be merry, and not worry about all the really kind of injustice and evil and suffering that's going on in the world. You just sort of try to create that little space for yourself. And he says that's the real problem with Epicureanism. It just sort of plugs our ears, right, to the cruelty and suffering in the world, and tries to create a little enclave where we can escape, right? And that's really not a good response to the pandemic either, he doesn't think. A third philosophical response, he says, is Platonism, where this present world is a shadow of reality, right? Sure, bad things happen here, but we are destined for a different world. And so he sees Platonism as another form of dualism, maybe not as strict. And if you know NT Wright a little bit, he really doesn't like dualism. He doesn't like it when it comes into Christianity either. He does not like the idea that when Christians say, well, all this is a mess, but I'm going to go after death to a place that we call heaven. He doesn't think about the afterlife in that way. So maybe we'll get into that. That's a constant theme in NT Wright. So those three philosophical responses that he thinks are wrong, right? Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Platonism. And he says he sees modern versions of these philosophies in relationship to the pandemic today, right? There are modern Stoics who are saying, well, we just have to tough it out, right? We grit our teeth and try to get through it. And, some people are going to die, and that's just the way things are, right? So he sees this as a version of modern Stoicism, and he sees this as a response that's going on amongst a number of people to the pandemic, right? We're just going to grit our teeth and tough it out because that's just the way things are, okay? Two, he says, and then there's also modern Epicureans, right, who say, well, pandemic, bad things happen, so you might as well try to make yourself as comfortable as you can. And he's, I think, being a bit cheeky but pretty funny. He says, while we, Epicureans, while we self-isolate, we just, want to make sure we have lots of Netflix and alcohol, right? So how are we going to get through this? Well, that's the way we're going to do it. That's modern Epicureanism. And the third version, he says, there are modern Platonists, right? And you're a dualist here, and you say, well, death isn't the worst thing that can happen to us, right? We're going to go to heaven anyway. And in a certain sense, I think he thinks the modern Platonists are essentially wanting to join the Epicureans, maybe on the golf course, right? And for cocktail hours, and we'll just get through this, right? That kind of thing. So we've seen, the gods must be angry, modern Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Platonism. He thinks all these answers are inadequate in light of the massive suffering that's going on that is caused by the pandemic. And he says he sees a better response from people who are asking the question, what can they do, rather than why is this happening, right? He gives the example of in the UK, where he is, the National Health Services put out a request for help, and 500,000 people volunteered to try to help out. And many at great cost who got sick, and some actually died. And so rather than asking these why questions, maybe the question is what can we do? And he sees this as in keeping with what the early church did. So he kind of shows this response, and then he goes back to the early church and he says, the example of the early church during times of plague was that, well, if you were well-to-do, you took off, right? You probably took off to the hills because the disease was in low-lying areas, and if you were well enough off, you would go off to your country retreat. But Christians didn't do that. They stayed and they tended to the sick, and they nursed them, and oftentimes they died as well, catching whatever disease was going on. And here we see, I think, Wright making kind of an apologetic move. He doesn't name it that in this book, but that's what he's doing. He said, well, and he said it was this kind of witness of the early church that caused the spread of the gospel. People saw Christians living this way, and other people weren't. It was very different from your Roman Stoics and Epicureans, right? What are these Christians doing? And people got very interested. And this caring for the poor, the sick, and the outcast that was practiced by the early church was part of the way in which it spread and grew in the world. And part of this kind of apologetic narrative is that in this way, Christian faith and practice has actually influenced many things we take for granted in the modern world, right? He wants to say that the modern world really kind of borrows from the Christian tradition. It's concerned to say that medicine and education and care should be extended to all people, right? He wants to say these are deeply Christian ideas that have shaped the West and shaped the world, even though many people in the world today, and especially in the modern West, have forgotten those religious roots. That's why it's an apologetic move. Okay? Now, in this chapter, he turns to some, what he sees as inadequate Christian responses to the pandemic. Again, we're clearing some brush before he gets into his argument, right? He says, this pandemic has caused conspiracy theories. Like any time in human beings, we're trying to say it's somebody else's fault, right? It's the Chinese's fault, it's the Americans' fault. Whose fault is it? Who can we point fingers to? And he says, well, Christians get involved in this conspiracy theory game as well, and we join in the blame game. We try to say, what is going wrong? Who's the blame? And when you have a conspiracy theory, you know exactly what God is trying to say through it, right? So he doesn't think this is a good response, kind of obviously, but that's one Christian response that's out there. Another Christian response that he sees as not helpful is this is a sign of the end, right? So there are lots of people, he says, who will take little bits and pieces of scripture and come up with a very elaborate and often gruesome end-time scenario. And this pandemic is now for them a sign that their particular end-time scenario is about to happen, right? So another Christian response is it's a sign of the end. Again, he doesn't think that's a very helpful response. Another Christian response is to see this as a moment of opportunity, right? We use this time to tell people about Jesus and how Jesus can take them to heaven. Again, he doesn't think that's a terribly helpful evangelical way to spread the message. But nonetheless, he sees that as an inadequate response as well. And the fourth one that he sees is as an inadequate response is God is angry at us. And he sees this as a Christian version of that ancient pagan theory, right, that we mentioned at the beginning, the gods must be angry. And in this case, people often turn to certain passages in the Old Testament to support their idea that God in this pandemic is acting to punish wrongdoing, right? And he says what is particularly unhelpful about this is that people who are making this argument are saying it's really other people and it's their lifestyle that we probably disapprove of, that God is punishing in this pandemic, right? And so we have these four Christian responses that he doesn't think is very helpful either. Conspiracy theories, right? Whose fault is it? A sign of the end time, that this is an opportunity to save souls, I suppose, or God is angry with us. Wright's book in the next 4 chapters are going to be an effort to find a better response, right? And he's going to begin with the Old Testament, move to Jesus and the Gospels, talk about the New Testament, and then have some concluding reflections. So that's sort of the shape of where he's going. So this first chapter, as we see, is really a framing of the questions, right, that we have about God and the pandemic, that we all maybe naturally have at this time, and then naming some of the answers people have given and saying, maybe they aren't all that helpful. And so kind of clearing the ground. Let's name them, right? And let's get them out there and let's hold them up under the light a little bit and then maybe put them aside and see if we can come up with a better way. And that is where he'll be going. So next week we'll be turning to his reflections on the Old Testament. Thank you.